the snow fell silently outside the cramped Boston apartment window on March 23, 2012, creating a curtain of white that muffled the sounds of the city below. Inside, 17-year-old Selene Moreau knelt beside her father's lifeless body, her small hands wrapped around fingers that had grown cold hours ago. Henri Moreau lay on the worn carpet of their living room, his face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for weeks. The bottle of sleeping pills sat empty on the coffee table beside a glass of water and a single sheet of paper covered in his careful handwriting. Selene hadn't read the note yet. She couldn't bring herself to look away from his face. "Papa," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "Papa, please wake up." But Henri Moreau would never wake up again. The man who had taught her to code when she was 8, who had stayed up countless nights explaining renewable energy concepts while she did homework at the kitchen table, who had believed that technology could save the world, he was gone. The events of the past month played through her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. The phone calls that had started coming at all hours. The men in expensive suits who appeared at their door with briefcases full of legal documents. Her father's company, Moreau Technologies, had been targeted for acquisition by Duvall Industries, and Henri had fought back with everything he had. "They offered me a way out," he had told her just 2 weeks ago, pacing their small kitchen while she made dinner. Alaric Duvall himself called, said he'd buy me out privately, quietly, enough money to pay our debts and start fresh somewhere else. Selene had looked up from the stove, hope flickering in her chest. That's good news, isn't it? But her father's expression had been troubled. Something felt wrong about it. The way he spoke, like he was offering charity rather than making a business deal, like he pitied me. Henri had rejected that private offer, choosing instead to fight the hostile takeover through proper channels. He had believed that his innovations, his patents, his small but dedicated team would be enough to survive. He had been wrong. Duvall Industries had moved with surgical precision, buying up Henri's debt, pressuring his investors, and systematically dismantling every avenue of resistance. Within 3 weeks, Moreau Technologies was bankrupt, its assets absorbed into Alaric Duvall's growing empire. Henri Moreau, the brilliant engineer who had dreamed of changing the world, found himself with nothing but shame and an empty bank account. Now Selene sat beside his body, understanding with crystal clarity that her father hadn't died of natural causes. He had been murdered not with a weapon, but with calculated cruelty designed to break his spirit completely. She finally reached for the note with trembling fingers. "My dearest Selene, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I cannot bear the weight of failure any longer. Everything I built, everything I worked for, has been taken by a man who saw my life's work as nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. I have failed you as a father. I have failed our family name. I have failed the dream of leaving you something better than what I inherited. You are stronger than me, my darling girl. You have fire in your heart that I never possessed. Use that fire. Build something beautiful from the ashes I'm leaving behind. Don't let them win. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Papa?" Selene read the words 3 times before the paper slipped from her fingers. The silence of the apartment pressed against her ears like deep water, broken only by the distant sound of sirens somewhere in the city. She looked at her father's face one more time, memorizing the lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the hands that had taught her everything she knew about technology and kindness. Then she stood, walked to the kitchen, and opened the drawer where her mother's old sewing kit lived. Inside, beneath spools of thread and packets of needles, she found what she was looking for, a small, sharp blade that her mother had used for delicate alterations. Selene returned to the living room and knelt beside her father once more. With steady hands, she pressed the blade to her palm and drew it across the skin. Blood welled up, bright red against her pale flesh, and she pressed her wounded hand to her father's cold fingers. "I swear to you, Papa," she whispered, her voice growing stronger with each word. I swear on my blood and yours that I will make him pay. Alaric Duvall destroyed our family, and I will destroy him. I will become everything he fears, everything he cannot control, and I will watch his empire crumble the way ours did." The blood from her palm mingled with the melting snow on the window as she pressed her hand against the glass, leaving a crimson print that would fade by morning, but the oath she spoke in that moment would burn in her heart for the next 12 years. "I will rise from these ashes stronger than he could ever be, and when I am ready, when I have the power to face him as an equal, I will show Alaric Duvall what it feels like to lose everything." Thunder rolled across Boston as if the sky itself had heard her promise. Hello, wonderful family. If you've made it this far, I need to tell you something important. I've trimmed this story down so you get the heart of it. No drawn-out filler, no circling back to say the same thing twice. We're going straight into the story. But before we go deep, I need you to help me keep telling stories like this. Please take a second right now to hit the like button. It's the simplest way to tell YouTube this is worth sharing. And if you think people need to hear how this woman's heartbreak and revenge plan turned into redemption and an ultimate love story, comment below. Also, if you're new here, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any moment of this amazing story. Now, you've done that, let's dive in. Today, the broken 17-year-old who had knelt beside her father's body no longer existed. That girl had died with Selene Moreau, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. Harvard Business School became her first battlefield. While her classmates networked at campus parties, Selene spent her nights in the library, studying not just business theory but the specific tactics used by corporate raiders like Alaric Duvall. She graduated summa cum laude, her senior thesis on renewable energy infrastructure, earning recognition from venture capitalists who saw potential in the young woman with fire in her dark eyes. By 25, she had founded Moreau Clean Energy with initial funding from investors who believed in her vision of sustainable technology. But Selene's real goal wasn't environmental salvation. It was positioning herself to become powerful enough to challenge the man who had destroyed her father. Every business decision was calculated with two purposes: building her empire and gathering intelligence on her enemy. She cultivated relationships with Duvall Industries' former employees, learning the internal workings of his company. She studied his acquisition patterns, identifying the psychological tactics he used to break his targets before absorbing their assets. By 27, Moreau Clean Energy had secured government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, making Selene one of the youngest self-made billionaires in American history. The business world began calling her the Phoenix, risen from ashes, beautiful and deadly to anyone who underestimated her. But those closest to her knew the truth. Every success, every victory, every strategic move had been calculated with one ultimate goal: destroying Alaric Duvall. She had studied him the way a hunter studies prey, learning his patterns, his weaknesses, his business practices. She knew he took his coffee black with no sugar, that he preferred German engineering to American excess, that he had never been married and maintained no close relationships. She knew the business world called him the Ice King, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy when it came to corporate warfare. But she also discovered details that didn't fit his reputation. Anonymous donations to literacy programs that couldn't be traced back to his company. Annual visits to his father's grave despite their reportedly hostile relationship. A pattern of avoiding layoffs during holiday seasons that suggested an inconvenient conscience. These contradictions gave Selene hope, because they suggested Alaric Duvall was not completely without humanity, and anything with a conscience could be destroyed by guilt. Now, at 29, she commanded an empire that rivaled anything her father had dreamed of building. She had become everything Alaric should fear: powerful, connected, and absolutely committed to his destruction. The blood oath she had sworn beside her father's body was finally ready to be fulfilled. The Meridian Tower stretched 50 floors into the Manhattan sky, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun like a weapon. On the 40th floor, in a conference room designed to intimidate lesser mortals, the most important meeting of Selene Moreau's life was about to begin. She arrived at exactly 8:00 a.m., as specified in the federal mandate that had forced this merger. The Department of Energy had determined that the growing clean energy sector needed consolidation to compete with international markets, and they had identified Moreau Clean Energy and Duvall Industries as prime candidates for combination. Neither CEO had been given a choice in the matter. Selene wore a charcoal gray suit that had been custom-tailored to project authority without sacrificing femininity. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon, and her only jewelry was a vintage watch that had belonged to her father, the same watch he had been wearing the night he died. She entered the conference room with the confidence of someone who owned the world, but her heart hammered against her ribs as she took in the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Manhattan, and the mahogany conference table could seat 20 people comfortably. At the far end sat a man she had seen in photographs but never encountered face-to-face. Alaric Duvall? At 43, he remained devastatingly handsome in the way that powerful men often are: sharp cheekbones, steel gray hair, and pale blue eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to the truth beneath. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, and when he looked up from his tablet to acknowledge her entrance, Selene felt the full force of his attention like a physical weight. "Miss Moreau." His voice was deep, cultured, with just a hint of an accent that suggested expensive European education. "Thank you for being punctual." "Mr. Duvall." She moved to the chair directly across from him, noting how he watched her every movement with the intensity of a predator assessing potential threats. "Though I should mention that punctuality implies choice in timing. We're both here because the federal government has decided our companies need adult supervision." Something flickered in his pale eyes, amusement perhaps, or recognition of a worthy opponent. "True, though I've found that some forms of supervision can be quite educational." "One forthing." The words carried implications that made Selene's skin prickle with awareness. This was a man accustomed to controlling every conversation, every interaction, every outcome. But she had spent 12 years preparing for this moment. "Education assumes there's something to learn," she replied, settling into her chair with deliberate grace. "I prefer to think of this as a temporary inconvenience that will both endure until the markets stabilize." "Temporary." Alaric repeated the word as if tasting it. "How optimistically American of you. In my experience, the most significant changes often begin with arrangements we initially consider temporary." Selene opened her portfolio and removed a stack of documents, using the movement to study his face more closely. The photographs hadn't captured the intelligence in his eyes or the way he held himself with absolute stillness, like a predator waiting to strike. They also hadn't captured the subtle signs of exhaustion she could see, now faint lines around his eyes, a slight tension in his jaw that suggested he wasn't sleeping well. "The Government Oversight Committee has provided preliminary frameworks for our collaboration," she said, sliding copies of the documents across the table. "Your signature is required on page 17. Alaric's fingers, long, elegant, with perfectly manicured nails, barely glanced at the papers before his gaze returned to her face. "How efficient. Though I suppose efficiency runs in your family." The comment hit like a physical blow. Selene's hand tightened imperceptibly around her pen, but her expression remained neutral. He knew. Of course he knew. The question was how much he remembered about the night he had destroyed her father. "Yes," she said, her voice betraying nothing of the rage building in her chest. "We Moreaus have always believed in getting things done, unlike some people who prefer to acquire what others have built rather than creating something original." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Alaric's reputation was built on hostile takeovers and corporate absorption rather than innovation. But instead of anger, Her words seemed to spark something like approval in his pale eyes. "Acquisition requires a different skill set than creation," he said. "One must understand not only what makes a company valuable, but what makes it vulnerable. The ability to see weakness where others see strength is quite useful in this business." "I'm sure it is." Selene placed his morning coffee black, no sugar, in the specific crystal tumbler. She had learned he preferred exactly where he could reach it without looking away from her. "The press conference is scheduled for Thursday. Try not to look too much like you're planning someone's funeral." For the first time that morning, something cracked in Alaric's composed facade. Not amusement, never that, but perhaps recognition that she had done her homework as thoroughly as he had done his. The meeting continued for another hour, covering logistics, legal frameworks, and the Byzantine requirements of federal oversight. But beneath the professional discussion, a different conversation was taking place. One conducted in careful glances, precise word choices, and the electric tension that filled the space between them. Selene had expected to hate him more after seeing him in person. She had expected the carefully banked rage of 12 years to burst into flame the moment she looked into the face of her father's killer. Instead, she found herself fascinated by the complexity she sensed beneath his cold exterior. This was not the cartoon villain she had built up in her mind. This was something far more dangerous, a brilliant, sophisticated predator who was clearly aware that she represented some kind of threat, even if he didn't yet understand what kind. As the meeting drew to a close, Selene gathered her materials with the same precision she brought to everything else. But as she stood to leave, Alaric's voice stopped her. "Miss Moreau." He remained seated, but his pale eyes were locked on her face with uncomfortable intensity. "I've been reviewing your company's portfolio in preparation for this merger. Your innovations in solar energy storage are quite impressive." "Thank you." The words came out more cautiously than she intended. "They remind me of some early work I saw years ago, a smaller company that was developing similar technology before." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, before market conditions made it impossible for them to continue. Selene's blood turned to ice water. He was talking about her father's company, about Moreau Technologies, about the night Henri Moreau had died alone and broken, because this man had decided to destroy him for sport. "Market conditions?" she repeated, her voice deadly quiet. "What an interesting euphemism." "Business can be brutal," Alaric said, and for just a moment, something that might have been regret flickered across his features. Good ideas sometimes emerge from companies that aren't strong enough to nurture them properly. It's fortunate when those ideas find their way to more capable hands. The implication was clear. He was suggesting that her innovations were somehow derived from her father's work, that even her greatest successes were connected to Alaric's past actions. It was a power play designed to remind her that he had touched every aspect of her life, even the parts she thought she had built independently. But instead of the rage he was probably expecting, Selene felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. This was the confirmation she had been waiting for, proof that Alaric Duvall remembered her father and was callous enough to reference his destruction as a casual business matter. "You're absolutely right," she said, her smile as sharp as broken glass. "Sometimes the most beautiful things do grow from ashes. Evolution in action." She moved toward the door, but his voice stopped her again. "Miss Moreau." She turned, one hand on the door handle. "I look forward to our continued collaboration." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Selene met his gaze directly, letting him see the fire that burned behind her professional composure. "So do I, Mr. Duvall. So do I." 3 days later, Selene received a message that changed everything. Not an email or a phone call, but a formal proposal delivered by courier to her office at 6 p.m. on a Friday, the kind of timing designed to ensure she would be alone when she opened it. The document was simple, elegant, and utterly shocking. Proposal for the establishment of the Henri Moreau Foundation for Innovative Technology. Full funding, 50 million initial endowment, additional annual contributions, 5 million oversight and direction. Selene Moreau, CEO funding source, Duvall Industries. Selene read the proposal 3 times before the words fully registered. Alaric Duvall wanted to establish a foundation in her father's name. Not just any foundation, but one specifically designed to support the kind of innovative research that Henri Moreau had been passionate about. The accompanying letter was brief and written in Alaric's precise handwriting. Miss Moreau, your father's work in renewable energy technology was ahead of its time. This foundation would ensure that future innovators have access to the resources your father lacked. I believe he would have approved. A. Duvall. Selene's hands trembled as she set the letter aside. This was not what she had expected. After their tense meeting, after his casual reference to market conditions that had destroyed her father's company, she had prepared for escalating corporate warfare. Instead, he was offering to honor Henri Moreau's memory with the kind of philanthropy that could genuinely help young inventors and researchers. It was either the most sophisticated manipulation she had ever encountered or something else entirely. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Alaric's direct line. Miss Moreau. His familiar voice filled her office through the speaker. I trust you've had time to review my proposal. I've read it, she said carefully. I have questions. I'm sure you do. Perhaps we could discuss it over dinner tomorrow evening, somewhere neutral. I believe there are things we should address privately before our professional relationship progresses any further. The suggestion was so unexpected that Selene found herself momentarily speechless. Alaric Duvall was asking her to dinner. The man who had destroyed her father was requesting a private meeting outside the formal structure of their forced merger. What kind of things? She asked. The kind that require honesty rather than corporate diplomacy. His voice carried a weight she couldn't quite interpret. The kind that should have been addressed 12 years ago. Selene's heart stopped. He knew. Somehow, he knew exactly who she was and what her father's death had meant to her. This wasn't a casual business dinner. It was an acknowledgement that their conflict was personal. Why? She asked, abandoning pretense. Why now? The silence stretched long enough that she wondered if he had hung up. When Alaric finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Because some debts can't be paid through lawyers and contracts. Because I've spent 12 years wondering what became of Henri Moreau's daughter. And because I think it's time we both stopped pretending this is just about business. Selene closed her eyes, feeling the careful walls she had built around her emotions beginning to crack. For 12 years, she had dreamed of the moment when she would confront her father's killer. She had planned speeches, accusations, the satisfaction of watching him crumble under the weight of his crimes. She had never planned for this quiet acknowledgement, a foundation in her father's name, and an invitation to honesty that felt more dangerous than any corporate battle. Saturday, she said finally. 7 o'clock. Le Bernardin. And Mr. Duvall? Yes? If this is some kind of game, if you're playing with my father's memory for strategic advantage, I will destroy you so completely that no one will remember you ever existed. I would expect nothing less, he replied. Until Saturday, Miss Moreau. The line went dead, leaving Selene alone in her office with a foundation proposal that could change everything and the terrifying realization that Alaric Duvall was not the simple villain she had spent 12 years preparing to defeat. He was something far more complex and dangerous, a man who remembered her father, who knew exactly what his actions had cost the Moreau family, and who was now offering either redemption or the most sophisticated trap she had ever encountered. As Manhattan settled into evening beyond her windows, Selene stared at the foundation proposal and wondered if 12 years of planning had prepared her for what was coming next. The blood oath she had sworn beside her father's body had sustained her through business school and the brutal climb to corporate power. But now, faced with the possibility that her enemy might be trying to make amends, she found herself in uncharted territory. Revenge was simple, justice was complicated, and whatever Alaric Duvall was offering, it didn't fit neatly into either category. Saturday night would bring answers. The question was whether Selene was ready to hear them. One thing was certain. The girl who had knelt beside her father's body 12 years ago, swearing a blood oath of vengeance, was about to face the test of everything she had become. And in a restaurant overlooking Central Park, two enemies would sit across from each other and discover whether some wounds could ever truly heal, or if some hatred was too deep to overcome. The Ice King and the Phoenix, circling each other in a dance as old as power itself, each carrying secrets that could destroy them both. The coffee shop on Fifth Avenue hummed with Monday morning energy, but the corner booth, where Selene sat, felt isolated from the world around her. She had chosen this location carefully public enough to seem innocent, private enough for the conversation that would destroy a man's life. Marcus Webb arrived precisely on time, sliding into the seat across from her with the eager energy of a bloodhound who had caught a scent. At 35, he had built his reputation at the Financial Tribune by exposing corporate corruption that others were too intimidated or too bought to pursue. His reputation for tenacity was matched only by his reputation for absolute accuracy. "Miss Moreau," he said, setting his recorder on the table between them, "thank you for reaching out. When you mentioned irregularities in corporate acquisition practices dating back over a decade, you certainly got my attention." Selene studied his face, noting the intelligence in his brown eyes and the slight tremor of excitement in his hands as he prepared his equipment. This man would be her weapon, the blade she would use to cut down everything Alaric Duvall had built. "Before we begin," she said, her voice carefully modulated, "I need your word that nothing we discuss today will be published without my explicit approval. The timing of this story is crucial." Webb nodded eagerly. "Of course. Background first, confirmation second, publication when you give the signal. Standard procedure for this kind of investigation." "Good." Selene opened her leather portfolio and removed a manila folder that had lived in her office safe for 12 years. "Then let's start with what you know about the Moreau Technologies acquisition in 2012. Webb consulted his notes. "Standard hostile takeover. Small tech company developing renewable energy storage solutions. The founder, Alaric Moreau, was over-leveraged and vulnerable when Duvall Industries moved in. Clean acquisition, legally speaking. No obvious irregularities. That's the public version," Selene said. The reality was far more calculated. She slid the first document across the table, a phone record showing a 43-minute call between Alaric Duvall's private line and Alaric Moreau's home number on March 21, 2012. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. "My father received a personal call from Alaric Duvall the night before the acquisition was announced publicly," she continued. "Duvall claimed he wanted to make a private offer enough money to pay my father's debts and allow him to start fresh somewhere else." Webb leaned forward, his journalist instincts fully engaged. "That sounds unusually generous for a hostile takeover." "It was completely fabricated." Selene's voice remained steady, factual, giving no hint of the emotions churning beneath her professional exterior. Alaric never intended to honor that offer. The entire conversation was psychological manipulation designed to achieve a specific outcome. She slid additional documents across the table, emails between Duvall Industries executives, financial records showing the systematic purchase of Henri's debt, and a timeline that revealed the acquisition had been planned months in advance. "My father had received 3 legitimate buyout offers that week," she explained. "Companies that genuinely wanted his technology and were willing to pay fair market value. But Duvall's late-night call convinced him to reject those offers and wait for the private deal that was never going to materialize." Webb's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. "This shows premeditation. Duvall deliberately isolated your father from legitimate options." "Exactly. By the time my father realized he'd been deceived, the other offers had expired, and his creditors were demanding immediate payment. Duvall Industries swept in with their hostile bid as the only remaining option, but at a fraction of what the legitimate buyers had offered. This is..." Webb shuffled through the papers, his excitement growing. "Miss Moreau, this evidence suggests fraud on a massive scale. The psychological manipulation alone could trigger federal investigations. Selene allowed herself a small, cold smile. Yes, it could. She handed him the rest of the folder. 12 years of meticulous research, documenting Alaric's pattern of predatory acquisitions, each one following a similar playbook of isolation, manipulation, and destruction. Duvall didn't just acquire companies, she said. He systematically destroyed the lives of their founders as a demonstration of power. He turned corporate acquisition into a form of psychological warfare. Webb was now completely absorbed in the documents, his recorder forgotten as he absorbed the scope of what she was showing him. The scale of this. It's not just one bad deal. It's a pattern spanning decades. Which brings us to the question of why I'm sharing this with you now. Webb looked up from the papers, his expression shifting from excitement to curiosity. Why now? Why not years ago when you first compiled this evidence? Selene met his gaze directly, letting him see the steel in her dark eyes. Because 12 years ago, I was a 17-year-old girl whose father had just committed suicide rather than face the complete destruction of everything he'd worked for. I wasn't strong enough then to take on someone like Alaric Duvall. The words hung in the coffee shop's ambient noise like a confession. Webb's expression shifted to something approaching awe as he realized the scope of what she had planned. You've been building a case against him for over a decade. I've been building myself into someone capable of bringing him down, she corrected. The case was always there. What I needed was the power to ensure people would listen. Webb leaned back in his chair, studying her with new respect. And now you have that power. Now I'm strong enough to watch him fall. The statement carried the weight of 12 years of grief, rage, and careful planning. Webb could see the truth in her eyes. This wasn't just about business or justice. This was personal vengeance served with corporate precision. There's one condition, Selene added, closing the folder but leaving it on the table between them. The merger between our companies must complete before any of this becomes public. If the evidence surfaces too early, it becomes worthless in court. How long do you need? 6 months, maybe less, depending on how quickly the federal oversight process moves. She stood, leaving the folder on the table. When I give you the signal, you'll have the biggest corporate scandal story of the decade. Webb clutched the folder like treasure, his mind already racing with possibilities. Miss Moreau, this will destroy him completely. His reputation, his business empire, everything. Selene paused at the edge of the booth, looking down at the journalist who would be her instrument of revenge. Good, she said simply. That's exactly what I want. The Meridian Tower's 42nd floor conference room had hosted countless high-stakes meetings, but the quarterly board review scheduled for Tuesday morning felt different. Selene arrived at 9:30 a.m. to find the usual collection of executives, lawyers, and federal oversight officials already assembled around the mahogany table. What she didn't find was Alaric Duvall. Has anyone heard from Mr. Duvall? Asked Janet Morrison, the lead federal representative overseeing their merger. We were scheduled to begin 30 minutes ago. Selene checked her phone, noting that Alaric's assistant had sent increasingly urgent messages over the past hour. The man who prided himself on punctuality was now 45 minutes late for the most important meeting of their merger process. I'll check his office, she said, standing with a grace that concealed her growing concern. The executive floor felt strangely quiet as she made her way to Alaric's corner office. His assistant's desk was empty. Apparently, she had gone to look for him as well. The mahogany door to his private office was closed, and when Selene knocked, she heard no response. Alaric? She tried the handle and found it locked from the inside. Alaric? The board meeting started an hour ago. Silence. Something cold settled in her stomach as she pressed her ear to the door. From inside, she could hear what sounded like labored breathing and the faint sound of something or someone moving across the floor. Alaric! She knocked harder, her professional composure beginning to crack. Answer me. Go away. His voice came through the wood, weak and strained in a way she had never heard before. Just go away, Selene. The use of her first name sent alarm bells through her system. In all their interactions, he had maintained scrupulous formality. For him to break that pattern meant something was seriously wrong. Like hell. She turned away from the door and strode to the security desk at the end of the hall. "I need you to open Mr. Duvall's office immediately." The security guard looked uncertain. "Ma'am, I'm not authorized to—" "I'm authorizing you." Her voice carried the kind of authority that made people obey without question. "Open it now." The guard fumbled with his keys, clearly uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to argue with someone who commanded boardrooms for a living. The lock clicked, and Selene pushed past him into the office. The scene that greeted her would be burned into her memory forever. Alaric Duvall, the Ice King himself, was curled on the Persian rug behind his desk, his perfectly tailored suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. His face was gray, his breathing shallow and irregular, and an overturned bottle of prescription medication had scattered white pills across the expensive carpet. Without thinking, Selene dropped to her knees beside him, her hands automatically moving to check his pulse and breathing. Years of first aid training from her college rowing team kicked in, overriding the complex emotions that seeing him vulnerable created. "What did you take?" Her voice was sharp, clinical, cutting through whatever haze of pain or medication was affecting him. "Alaric, what did you take?" His pale eyes opened with obvious effort, focusing on her face with the intensity of someone trying to anchor themselves to reality. "Pain medication. Too much. Didn't mean to. It just hurts so much." "Pain from what?" But even as she asked the question, she was noticing things she had missed before: the way his expensive clothes hung looser than they should, the slight tremor in his hands that she had attributed to caffeine, the gray undertone to his skin that spoke of something eating him alive from the inside. "Doesn't matter," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let me go, Selene. You'll get everything you wanted anyway." The words hit her like physical blows. He knew. Somehow, he knew about her plans, about the evidence she had given to Webb, about the 12-year campaign of revenge that was finally coming to fruition. "Sir, the paramedics are on their way," the security guard called from the doorway, his radio crackling with emergency dispatch communications. Selene maintained pressure on Alaric's wrist, monitoring his pulse while her mind raced. This man was her enemy, the focus of 12 years of hatred and careful planning. She should feel satisfaction seeing him broken and vulnerable on his office floor. Instead, she felt something she couldn't quite identify: concern, perhaps, or the unwelcome recognition that human suffering was still human suffering, regardless of who was experiencing it. "Stay with me," she said, though she wasn't sure why. "The paramedics will be here soon." Alaric's hand caught hers with surprising strength, his fingers closing around her wrist with desperate intensity. "The journal," he said, his voice urgent despite his obvious pain. "In the safe. Read it. Then decide if you still want to destroy me." "What journal?" "Everything's in there. Everything you need to know." His grip tightened. "Password is your father's birthday." The paramedics arrived in a flurry of professional efficiency, pushing Selene aside as they began their assessment. She watched from the corner of the office as they worked, stabilizing Alaric's condition and preparing him for transport to Mount Sinai Hospital. As they loaded him onto a stretcher, his eyes found hers one more time. "The safe," he mouthed silently. "Please." Then he was gone, wheeled away by strangers who would try to save his life while she stood alone in his office, staring at the wall safe he had mentioned. The combination lock waited beside a Monet painting that probably cost more than most people's houses. Her father's birthday, 4/15/1959. The safe opened with a soft click that seemed to echo in the empty office like a gunshot. Inside, alongside legal documents and financial records that probably represented millions of dollars in assets, Selene found a leather-bound journal that looked like it had been handled countless times over many years. Her name was written on the cover in Alaric's precise handwriting: "For Selene Moreau, when the time comes to understand." She carried the journal to his desk, the same imposing mahogany surface where they had conducted their tense merger negotiations, and settled into his leather chair. Outside, Manhattan continued its relentless pace 42 floors below. But inside this office, time seemed suspended. The first entry was dated March 15th, 2012, 1 week before her father's death. Entry 1, March 15, 2012. I saw her today, Henri Moreau's daughter. She was at his office, supposedly helping with filing, but really she was watching me with those dark eyes that miss nothing. 17 years old, and she looked at me like she could see straight through every word I spoke to her father. She has his eyes dark and intelligent and completely unafraid. When I shook her hand, she didn't flinch from the contact, the way most people do. She looked at me like she was taking my measure and finding me. Interesting, dangerous, maybe, but interesting. I find myself wondering what it would be like to be looked at by someone like that without calculation, without agenda, just seen for what I am rather than what I can provide or what I might take away. The takeover is set for next week. Henri still believes my private offer is genuine. He's a good man, trying to survive in a world designed to devour good men. I should call it off. I should let him accept one of the legitimate offers he's received. I won't. Not because I need his company, I have plenty of companies, but because his daughter saw something in me that I can't afford to let anyone see. Better to be feared than understood. Her name is Selene. It means moon goddess in Greek. Even her name is beautiful. Selene's hands trembled as she turned the page. This wasn't what she had expected. This wasn't the cold calculation of a corporate predator. This was something far more disturbing: obsession wrapped in self-justification. Entry 2, March 22, 2012. It's done. Henri Moreau is dead by his own hand, and I am exactly who I've always been: a man who destroys things, because destruction is easier than creation. I watched the news coverage of his suicide, and all I could think about was his daughter. Where is she now? Who's taking care of her? What will she do with the fire I saw burning behind those dark eyes? I told myself the takeover was business, standard procedure. But I know the truth now, that it's too late to matter. I destroyed Henri Moreau because his daughter looked at me and saw something I've spent my entire adult life hiding: the part of me that still believes in goodness, that still wants to be worthy of respect rather than just fear. She saw the man I could have been, and I couldn't bear being seen that clearly. So I eliminated the source of that vision. Her name is Selene, and I've stolen her light. Now I'll spend whatever time I have left living in the darkness I created. The entries continued, year after year, documenting an obsession that grew rather than faded with time. Alaric had tracked her progress through high school, her acceptance to Harvard, her graduation with honors. He had been there, invisible, watching her transform grief into determination. Entry 156, September 3, 2018. She founded her own company today, Moreau Clean Energy. The name is a direct challenge. She's reclaiming what I took from her father and building something bigger from the ashes. The business plan is brilliant. Innovative technology, solid financial projections, and a vision that could actually change how the world thinks about renewable energy. She's become everything I knew she could be: stronger, smarter, more determined than anyone who hasn't lived through complete loss could ever become. Part of me is proud. The same part that destroyed her father now takes perverse satisfaction in what she's built from that destruction. I made her into this, the phoenix rising from ashes. My greatest crime became her greatest strength. I want to help her. I want to use my resources, my connections, to ensure she succeeds. But how do you help someone whose life you've already destroyed once? Selene read through the night, through entries that detailed her every public appearance, her business victories, the careful way Alaric had manipulated situations to benefit her company while making it look like coincidence or her own brilliance. Entry 847, January 3, 2024. The government is forcing the merger. In 6 months, I'll have to sit across from her at conference tables, and pretend I don't know exactly how many steps she takes from the elevator to her office, 47, or that she drinks her coffee with 1 sugar, never 2, or that she still wears her father's watch on her right wrist because it was too large for her left. The doctors gave me the diagnosis yesterday: pancreatic cancer, stage 4. 6 to 8 months if the treatments work, less if they don't. I should be terrified. Instead, I find myself thinking that I'll finally get to see her every day, even if she hates me, even if hate is all I deserve. Maybe this is cosmic justice. Maybe I'll die just as she finally gets the revenge she's been building toward for 12 years. Maybe that's exactly what should happen. The revelation hit Selene like ice water. Alaric was dying, had been dying for months while she planned his destruction. The foundation offer, the subtle changes in his behavior, the way he had looked at her during their meetings, it all made sense now. Entry 923, October 1, 2024. She gave Webb the evidence today. I've been monitoring his communications for months, waiting for this moment. She has enough to destroy me 10 times over, and she's finally ready to use it. I should feel betrayed. Instead, I feel proud. She's become exactly what I knew she could be: strong enough to bring down the monster who made her. I won't fight it. Let her have her revenge. It's the only gift I can give her now. The only way to balance the scales for what I took from her family. The pain is getting worse. The medication helps, but it makes me foggy, emotional. Yesterday, I almost called her Selene instead of Miss Moreau in our meeting. She would have killed me with her bare hands if I'd shown that kind of familiarity. Good. I hope she does kill me. It would be a more honest ending than cancer. The final entry was dated just 3 days ago. Entry 984, FUT, November 15, 2024. I collapsed during the board meeting today. She found me. She touched me without hatred, checked my pulse with hands that were gentle instead of vengeful. For 30 seconds, Selene Moreau touched me with something that might have been compassion, and it was the most beautiful moment of my worthless life. I'm going to tell her everything. Not because I expect forgiveness, I don't deserve it and she shouldn't give it, but because she deserves to know that destroying her father was the worst thing I've ever done, and falling in love with her was the best. If I'd lived long enough, if I'd been a different man, I would have asked her to marry me. Not because I deserved her, but because she taught me how to feel human again, instead of just dangerous. She'll read this after I'm gone. Selene, my moon goddess, my beautiful enemy. I know you hate me. I know I earned that hatred. But please know that loving you from a distance was the only good thing I managed to do with the time I was given. Love doesn't have to be war. I just didn't learn that in time to matter. Selene closed the journal as dawn broke over Manhattan, tears streaming down her face. Outside, the city was beginning another day of endless ambition and ruthless competition. But inside Alaric's office, surrounded by the remnants of his empire, she felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the past 12 years. He had loved her. The Ice King had loved her from the beginning, and his guilt over destroying her father had been consuming him long before the cancer started. Every success she'd achieved, every victory she'd won, had been shaped by his invisible influence, not to control her, but to help her become everything her father would have wanted her to be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Webb. "Story is ready. Just need your go-ahead to publish." Selene stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Instead, she called Mount Sinai Hospital. "This is Selene Moreau. I need to know the condition of Alaric Duvall." The private wing of Mount Sinai Hospital felt like a different world from the corporate battlefields where she and Alaric had waged their careful war. Here, surrounded by the quiet efficiency of medical equipment and the subdued lighting designed to promote healing, Selene found herself facing a version of her enemy she had never seen before. Alaric lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller than she had ever thought possible. Without his perfectly tailored suits and commanding presence, he seemed almost fragile, pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, silver hair disheveled against white pillows, machines monitoring vital signs that painted a grim story of his condition. But his eyes were alert when she entered, watching her face with the same intensity she remembered from their conference room confrontations. "You read it." Not a question. His voice was hoarse from medication and whatever treatments they were giving him, but it still carried the cultured authority she had learned to recognize. All of it. Selene moved to the visitor's chair beside his bed, still wearing the same clothes from yesterday, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled from a night spent discovering that everything she thought she knew about her enemy was wrong. "Why didn't you tell me?" "What was I supposed to say? Sorry I destroyed your father and drove him to suicide, but I'm dying of cancer and I've been obsessively in love with you for 12 years. His laugh was bitter, painful. "You would have thought it was another manipulation, wasn't it?" No. The simple word carried absolute conviction. Everything else was manipulation, calculation, strategy. Every business deal, every acquisition, every relationship I've ever had. But not this. Never this. Selene studied his face, searching for the lies she had trained herself to detect, the subtle tells that had helped her survive in a world full of predators. But all she saw was exhaustion and something that looked dangerously like hope. "The foundation offer, the way you've been different in our meetings, the things you said about my company." She gestured vaguely at the machines surrounding his bed. "How long have you known?" "About the cancer?" "Since January." "About loving you?" Alaric closed his eyes briefly, as if the admission cost him something vital. "Since the moment I met you. Since I watched a 17-year-old girl look at me like she could see straight through to my soul and realized that I would never be worthy of that kind of clarity." The words hung in the sterile hospital air like a confession. Selene felt 12 years of carefully constructed hatred wavering on its foundation, threatened by the raw honesty in his voice. "So you destroyed my father instead." "I destroyed your father because I was a coward." Alaric's eyes opened, meeting hers with devastating directness. "Because he had something I'd never had: a family who loved him unconditionally, a daughter who looked at him like he hung the stars. Because when you looked at me that day in his office, I saw what I could have been if I'd made different choices, and you couldn't stand that. I couldn't stand being seen that clearly by someone so pure." His voice grew quieter, more strained. It was easier to destroy the source of that vision than to try to live up to it. Selene was quiet for a long time, processing information that rewrote everything she thought she knew about her life. Her purpose, the driving force that had shaped 12 years of decisions. Finally, she spoke. "I gave Webb evidence that could destroy your company, your reputation, everything you've built. I know. You're not going to fight it?" "No." Alaric's matter-of-fact tone suggested he had already accepted this outcome. "Let him publish it. Let the world know what I really am. You have enough evidence to trigger federal investigations, congressional hearings, criminal charges. I'll be dead before most of it reaches court, but my name will become synonymous with everything wrong with corporate America. Why would you want that? Because it's true. Because other people deserve protection from men like me. Because your father's death should mean something more than just personal tragedy." Alaric's grip tightened slightly on the blanket covering him. "And because you deserve your revenge." Selene stared at him. This man who had been the focus of her hatred for so long, who was now offering to sacrifice everything for her sense of justice. The Ice King was melting, and underneath was someone she didn't recognize, someone vulnerable and broken and desperately, quietly in love. "What if I don't want revenge anymore?" she asked. The question surprised them both. Alaric's eyes widened, and Selene realized she meant it. Sitting here beside his deathbed, listening to his confessions and seeing his genuine remorse, the burning need for vengeance that had sustained her for 12 years was transforming into something else entirely. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want to understand. I want to know who you really are underneath all the careful control and calculated cruelty. I want to know what you would have been like if you'd been brave enough to let someone love you." Alaric was quiet for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I would have tried to deserve you. I would have spent every day for the rest of my life trying to become the man you saw in me that first day, instead of the monster I chose to be. You still could. I'm dying, Selene. Weeks, maybe a month if I'm unlucky enough to linger. Then don't waste whatever time you have left hating yourself." She reached for his hand, feeling how cold and fragile his fingers had become. "Show me who you could have been, not for redemption, not for forgiveness, but because love doesn't have to end with death." Tears gathered in Alaric's pale eyes as he stared at her. "You would do that? After everything I've done? After all the pain I've caused? You would give me that gift?" "I would give us both that gift." Selene's voice was steady, certain. "We can't change the past, but we can choose how the story ends." Alaric brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "What about Webb? What about the evidence?" Selene pulled out her phone, scrolled to the journalist's message, and deleted it without reading it again. "Webb can wait. Some stories are more important than revenge." Outside the hospital window, Manhattan hummed with its endless ambitions and ruthless competitions. But inside room 1247, two enemies began the delicate process of becoming something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with corporate warfare and everything to do with the strange alchemy that could transform hatred into understanding, vengeance into grace, and the end of one story into the beginning of another. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. Selene jerked awake in her penthouse apartment, her heart hammering as she reached for her phone. "Miss Moreau, this is Dr. Rachel Kim at Mount Sinai. Mr. Duvall asked me to call you if his condition changed." Selene was already reaching for her clothes. "How bad?" "He's stable for now, but he collapsed again, more severely this time. Miss Moreau." The doctor's voice was gentle. "You should come. Soon." She found Alaric in the ICU, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. His skin was translucent, stretched too tight over sharp bones, but his eyes were open and alert when she entered. "You came," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I hoped you would, but I thought—" He struggled for breath. "I thought you might decide I wasn't worth watching die." Selene pulled the visitor's chair close to his bed, close enough to take his hand. His fingers were cold, fragile as bird bones, but they tightened around hers with surprising strength. "Tell me about Portugal," she said. Alaric's eyes widened. "What?" "The coastal estate. It's in your will, the one you've rewritten 17 times in the last 6 months. You want to be buried there. Tell me why." He was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory. "I bought it after your father died. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't look at myself in mirrors. So I flew to Portugal and found this place on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. The house was falling apart, but the view—" He smiled slightly. "The view was like looking at the edge of the world. You restored it." "I tried to. Every weekend for 12 years I'd fly out there and work on it myself. Tiling bathrooms, painting walls, fixing broken shutters. It was the only place I could go where I wasn't the Ice King, where I was just Alaric." Selene studied his face, seeing past the illness to the man underneath. "You were hiding." "I was trying to build something beautiful, something that might balance out all the ugly things I'd done." His grip on her hand tightened. "I used to think about bringing you there someday, showing you the sunset from the terrace, cooking dinner in that kitchen I spent 3 years renovating." "Alaric, I know it's impossible. I know you hate me. But in my dreams, you'd see the man I could have been instead of the monster I chose to become." The machines beeped their electronic lullabies, marking time in a room that felt suspended between life and death. Selene stared at their joined hands, her olive skin against his paper-white palm, and felt something crack open in her chest. "Take me there," she said. Alaric's eyes snapped to her face. "What?" "Portugal. The house. Take me there." "Selene, I can't travel. I can barely." "Yes, you can." Her voice was fierce, determined. You can last long enough for one trip, 1 week. You owe me that much. I owe you everything. But why would you want? Because I need to see it. She leaned closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. I need to see who you might have been. The private jet touched down in Lisbon on a Thursday morning, and by afternoon they were driving along the coast in a rented car that Alaric was too weak to operate. Selene had learned to drive in college, but rarely needed to in Manhattan. Now, she navigated winding cliff roads while Alaric gave quiet directions from the passenger seat. There, he said finally, pointing to a narrow road that disappeared between eucalyptus trees. Turn here. The house revealed itself gradually, like a secret being shared. It was smaller than Selene had expected, weathered stone and whitewashed walls, climbing roses that had grown wild over the years, windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in golden fragments. It's beautiful, she said, meaning it. Alaric struggled out of the car, leaning heavily on the walking stick he'd grudgingly accepted, and led her to the terrace that overlooked the Atlantic. The view was breathtaking, endless blue water stretching to the horizon, waves that crashed against black rocks far below, seabirds that rode the wind currents like acrobats. This is where I come to think, he said, settling carefully into one of the weathered chairs. This is where I've been writing in that journal for 12 years. Selene stood at the stone railing, letting the sea wind tangle her hair, breathing air that tasted of salt and possibilities. For the first time in years, she felt something inside her chest, loosen some knot of anger and purpose that had been wound so tight she'd forgotten it was there. Why did you really destroy my father? She asked, without turning around. I told you. I was afraid. The real reason, Alaric, not the noble version you've convinced yourself of. The truth. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible over the wind, because I envied him. Selene turned to face him. Henri Moreau had something I'd never had. A family who loved him. A daughter who looked at him like he hung the stars. A life that meant something beyond profit margins and market share. Alaric's hands trembled as he reached for the glass of water she'd brought him. I looked at him and saw everything I'd never be. So I destroyed him. And then you spent 12 years destroying yourself. Yes. The simple admission hung between them like a bridge. Selene moved to the chair beside his, close enough to see the way the late afternoon light played across his too thin face, highlighting the sharp cheekbones and the shadows beneath his eyes. Tell me about your family, she said. There's nothing to tell. There's always something to tell. Alaric stared out at the ocean, and for a moment he looked like a man remembering a dream. My mother was French, beautiful, ethereal, completely unsuited for marriage to a ruthless businessman. She left when I was 8. And your father? Taught me that love is weakness, that emotions are tools to be used or eliminated, that the only thing that matters is winning. Alaric's smile was bitter. He died alone in a hospital room, and the only person at his funeral was the lawyer reading his will. Is that how you want to die? The question hit him like a physical blow. Alaric closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. No, he whispered. God, no. But I don't know how to do anything else. They stayed for a week, 7 days that felt suspended outside of time, where the rest of the world ceased to exist, and there was only the sound of waves and the gradual, careful dissolution of 12 years of hatred. Alaric showed her the rooms he'd restored, the kitchen with its hand-painted tiles, the library where he'd read every book twice, the bedroom with windows on 3 sides that filled with light every morning. Each space was perfect, crafted with the attention to detail of someone who had nothing but time and the desperate need to create something beautiful. You could have hired people to do this, Selene said, running her fingers along the smooth surface of a table he'd built from driftwood. I needed to do it myself. I needed to prove I could build something instead of just destroying it. That night, they ate dinner on the terrace under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Selene had found ingredients in the village and cooked something simple but perfect: tomatoes and fish and bread that tasted like sunshine. Alaric ate more than she'd seen him consume in weeks, and for moments at a time, he almost looked healthy. "You know," he said, setting down his wine glass, "in all my dreams about bringing you here, I never thought it would actually happen." "What did you think would happen? That you'd hate it? That you'd see through my attempts to be someone better and walk away?" He studied her face in the candlelight. "That you'd realize I was still the same monster who destroyed your father?" Selene was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "You are the same man who destroyed my father, but you're also the man who spent 12 years trying to atone for it. Both things are true. Can you forgive both?" The question hung in the warm Portuguese air like a prayer. Selene stared at him across the small table. This man who had been her enemy for so long, who was now dying in front of her with such quiet dignity that it broke her heart. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'm willing to try." On their fourth night, she found him on the terrace at 3 a.m., staring at stars and shivering in the Portuguese wind. Without thinking, she brought him a blanket, settling it around his shoulders before taking the chair beside him. "Can't sleep? Pain," he said simply. "The medication isn't helping much anymore." Selene studied his profile in the starlight, noting the way his hands shook, the careful way he held himself, as if any sudden movement might shatter something vital. "Tell me what it feels like," she said. "Why?" "Because I want to understand." So he told her. About the fire that lived in his abdomen, about the way simple tasks had become monumental challenges, about the strange clarity that came with knowing your days were numbered. He spoke without self-pity, matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "Of dying?" "No." Alaric turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something that took her breath away. "I'm afraid of leaving you." "You don't have me to leave, don't I?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Selene felt her carefully constructed walls wavering, threatened by the honesty in his voice and the way he was looking at her. Not like the Ice King looked at a business rival, but like a man looked at a woman he loved beyond reason. "Alaric, I know it's impossible. I know I don't deserve it, but these 4 days have been the happiest of my life." His voice was barely above a whisper. "For 4 days, I've gotten to pretend that you might actually care whether I live or die." Selene reached for his hand, threading their fingers together. His skin was cold, fragile, but his grip was surprisingly strong. "I do care," she said. "I hate that I care, but I do." On their last night, they made love, not the violent, desperate coupling of enemies, but something tender and careful and heartbreaking. Alaric touched her like she was made of spun glass, like he was afraid she might disappear if he held on too tightly. Selene moved above him in the moonlight, streaming through those 3 windows, watching his face transform from the cold mask she'd known for years into something open and vulnerable and beautiful. It began with a kiss on the terrace as they watched the sun set over the Atlantic. The sky burned crimson and gold, and when Alaric turned to say something about the beauty of it, he found Selene looking at him instead of the horizon. "What?" he asked. "You," she said simply. "Just you." The kiss was soft at first, tentative, a question rather than a statement. But when Selene's arms came around him, when she pulled him closer despite his fragility, it became something else entirely. 12 years of careful distance dissolving into heat and need, and the terrifying joy of finally touching the person who had become essential to his existence. They moved inside slowly, Alaric leaning on her more than his walking stick, both of them understanding without words that this night was different. This night was theirs. In the bedroom, with its 3 windows and its view of the endless sea, they undressed each other with the reverence of people who understood that time was finite, that some moments were too precious to rush. Alaric's body bore the marks of his illness, too thin, too pale, marked by medical procedures. But Selene touched him like he was still the powerful man who commanded boardrooms, like his scars were maps of a journey that had brought him to her. "I never thought," he whispered against her hair as she settled against his chest. "I never thought anyone would look at me like this." "Like what?" Like I'm worth saving instead of destroying." She raised her head to meet his eyes, seeing in them all the vulnerability he'd spent a lifetime hiding. "You are worth saving. You always were. You just forgot how to see it." They moved together with the careful synchronicity of two people learning each other's rhythms, discovering how to give and receive tenderness after years of treating intimacy as warfare. When Selene arched above him, her dark hair falling like curtains around their faces, Alaric looked up at her and saw not his enemy or his victim's daughter, but simply the woman who had taught him what love felt like when it was real instead of strategic. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets that smelled of Portuguese lavender, and Alaric traced patterns on her bare shoulder with fingers that trembled from more than illness. "I love you," he said into the darkness. "I know it's too late, and I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed to say it once, out loud, to you." Selene pressed her face against his chest, listening to the irregular rhythm of his heart, breathing in the scent of his skin, memorizing the feel of his hands in her hair. "I know," she whispered. "I love you too." It was the first time either of them had said the words to another person. The first time the Ice King had allowed himself to be vulnerable. The first time the Phoenix had let someone see her without her armor. They talked through the night, about everything and nothing. Alaric told her about the books in his library, about the gardens he'd planned but never planted, about the dreams he'd had of growing old with someone who understood him. Selene talked about her father, about the good memories from before Duvall Industries, about the future she'd imagined building from the ashes of revenge. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, they made love again. Slower this time, with the desperate tenderness of people who knew they were stealing moments from fate. Alaric whispered her name like a prayer, and Selene kissed away the tears that tracked down his cheeks. "Promise me something," he said as morning light filled the room. "What?" "Promise me you'll remember this. Not the hate, not the revenge, not all the ugly things that brought us here. Promise me you'll remember that we had this. I promise." But when she woke to the sun streaming through those 3 windows, she was alone. Selene found the letter on the pillow where Alaric's head had rested, written in his precise handwriting on paper that bore the letterhead of the Portuguese house. "My beautiful moon goddess, if you're reading this, I've done what I do best. I've run from the good thing in my life before I could destroy it. By now, you've probably realized that I'm not coming back to New York. I can't watch you watch me die. I can't let your last memory of me be tubes and machines and the kind of slow decay that makes love feel like obligation. You gave me something I never thought I'd have, a week of being the man I should have been instead of the monster I chose to become. That gift is enough to last whatever time I have left. I'm leaving you everything. Not just the money and the properties, but the responsibility. Build something beautiful from the ashes of my empire. Hire the people I fired. Fund the research I shut down. Be the leader I never had the courage to become. There's a foundation I've established in your father's name, not just for show, but with real funding and real purpose. Use it to help other daughters whose fathers are destroyed by men like me. Break the cycle. You asked me once what legacy I wanted to leave. I want my legacy to be you. Strong, brilliant, beautiful you, using what I've given you to heal some small part of the world I helped break. One last thing. I would have asked you to marry me, not because I deserved you, but because you taught me what love feels like when it's real, instead of just a weapon. In another life, in a world where I made better choices, I would have spent 50 years learning how to make you happy. Live for both of us now. Live beautifully. Forever yours, Alaric." Selene read the letter 3 times before the tears came. Then she called his phone, called the hospital, called every contact she had in New York. But Alaric Duvall had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. 2 weeks later, a lawyer called with news of his death, quietly, in a private clinic in Switzerland, surrounded by strangers who were paid to care but didn't know his name meant ice in a dozen languages, or that he'd spent 12 years learning how to love someone he'd never allowed himself to have. The video message arrived on a rainy Thursday, exactly 1 month after Portugal. Selene sat in what had been Alaric's office, now hers, though she hadn't changed anything except adding a single framed photo of her father to the desk, and watched the face that had haunted her dreams appear on her laptop screen. He looked impossibly fragile, sitting in what appeared to be a hospital room with white walls and sterile lighting. But his pale eyes were clear, focused, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet intensity that had always made her listen. If you're watching this, I've kept my promise to myself to die with some dignity intact. I hope you can forgive me for leaving the way I did. I hope you can understand that watching you grieve for me would have been more than I could bear. Alaric paused, his hands folding carefully in his lap. Even dying, he maintained perfect posture. I've left you everything, Selene. Not because I think money can buy forgiveness, but because you're the only person I trust to use it well. The merger documents are signed, your clean energy contracts are secure. The foundation is fully funded with a board of directors you approve of. The house in Portugal is yours, along with detailed instructions for the gardens and the small repairs it will need. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and Selene found herself leaning closer to the screen, as if she could somehow reach through time and space to comfort him. But most importantly, I'm leaving you my confession. Complete records of every unethical deal, every manipulation, every life I destroyed in the name of profit. Use them. Publish them. Let the world know what I really was, and let that knowledge protect others from men like me. Alaric closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. I know you'll read this and think I'm still trying to manipulate you. Still trying to control the narrative even from the grave. Maybe you're right. Maybe I am. But I need you to know that loving you was the first real thing I ever felt, and it was also the best thing I ever did. The video flickered, and for a moment she thought it might end there. But then Alaric leaned forward, closer to the camera, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his pale eyes, could almost feel his breath against her skin. If I'd lived, I would have asked you to marry me. Not in some grand gesture, not with diamonds and declarations, but quietly, privately, the way you make your morning coffee. I would have asked you to build a life with me in that house overlooking the sea, to teach me how to be happy instead of just successful. His smile was soft, sad, and utterly without the calculation she'd grown used to seeing in his face. But I didn't live. And you'll have to build that happiness without me. Find someone worthy of you, Selene. Someone who sees your light from the beginning instead of spending 12 years trying to extinguish it. Promise me you won't let what I did to your father, what I did to you, make you afraid of love. The video ended with Alaric reaching toward the camera, his hand freezing in mid-gesture as if he were trying to touch her face one last time. Selene sat in the silence that followed. Rain pattering against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the office that now belonged to her, staring at the blank screen and feeling the weight of an empire she'd never wanted settling around her shoulders. Outside, Manhattan hummed with its endless ambitions and ruthless competitions. But inside what had once been the Ice King's domain, a woman who had learned that love could bloom even in the ruins of hatred began the work of building something beautiful from the ashes of what had come before. The Portuguese sunrise painted the Atlantic in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had filled the sky on their last morning together. Selene stood on the terrace of the coastal house, wearing one of Alaric's white cotton shirts, soft fabric that still held the faintest trace of his cologne, and holding a glass of the wine they had shared on their final night. A year had passed since she had woken to find him gone, since she had read his farewell letter and felt her world shift on its axis. 12 months of transformation that had reshaped not only her own life, but the lives of thousands of others whose stories had become intertwined with the legacy of two people who had found love in the ruins of hatred. The Duvall-Moreau merger had become something neither government regulators nor corporate analysts had expected. Instead of the typical consolidation that eliminated jobs and maximized profits, Selene had created the world's largest clean energy cooperative, a company that operated on principles of environmental sustainability and social responsibility that would have been foreign to the old Duvall Industries. She had kept her promise to build something beautiful from the ashes of Alaric's empire. The corporate headquarters in Manhattan now housed research labs developing breakthrough solar technology. The factories that had once manufactured components for fossil fuel extraction now produced wind turbines and battery storage systems. Most importantly, the company's profits were reinvested into communities that had been damaged by decades of environmental exploitation. The Selene Moreau Foundation had exceeded every expectation. With its $50 million endowment and annual contributions from the merged company, it had provided scholarships to over 200 young engineers and inventors, many of them from families who had lost everything to corporate predators, like the man Alaric had once been. Each scholarship recipient received not just financial support, but mentorship from scientists who understood that innovation meant nothing without conscience. Selene had also kept her other promise, though it had been more difficult than building a clean energy empire. 6 months after Alaric's death, she had given Marcus Webb permission to publish his exposé. The series of articles that followed had triggered federal investigations, congressional hearings, and fundamental changes to corporate acquisition law. Alaric's name had become synonymous with the kind of predatory capitalism that destroyed lives for profit margins, exactly what he had wanted. But the public condemnation had been easier to bear than the private knowledge of who he had really been underneath the Ice King persona. Only Selene knew about the man who had spent 12 years building a house with his own hands, who had loved her from a distance with a devotion that had ultimately consumed him, who had chosen to die alone rather than burden her with watching his decline. Standing on the terrace where they had shared their first honest conversation, she could feel his presence in every detail he had crafted with such care. The stone railing where she now rested her wine glass, worn smooth by Portuguese storms and Alaric's hands. The climbing roses that bloomed in profusion, tended by gardeners who followed his detailed instructions. The weathered teak furniture that he had chosen for its ability to withstand both time and the elements. "I kept my promise," she said to the morning sky, her voice carrying across the empty terrace. "I built something beautiful. I used what you gave me to help people instead of destroying them. The world is a little bit better because you chose to love me instead of hate yourself." A seabird cried in the distance, riding the wind currents that carried the scent of salt and possibility. Selene closed her eyes, letting the Portuguese sun warm her face, remembering the way Alaric had looked at this same view with wonder instead of calculation. Her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant in New York. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for tomorrow, where she would present the latest expansion of their renewable energy initiatives. 3 new solar facilities in developing nations, funded entirely by foundation grants. A breakthrough in battery technology that could revolutionize electric vehicles. A partnership with universities to train the next generation of environmental engineers. All of it built on the foundation of Alaric's guilt and redemption. All of it possible because a dying man had chosen love over pride, legacy over self-preservation. But Selene wasn't thinking about board meetings or corporate responsibility as she stood on the terrace that had become her annual pilgrimage site. She was thinking about the man who had spent his final months trying to become worthy of a love he never believed he deserved, who had given her not just his fortune but his complete vulnerability, who had taught her that even the most damaged hearts could learn to heal if they were brave enough to admit their wounds. The discovery happened by accident, as the most significant moments often do. Selene was in the bedroom, changing the linens in preparation for her departure back to New York, when she noticed that one of the wooden floorboards near the closet seemed slightly raised. She had been coming to the Portuguese house every year on the anniversary of their week together, treating it as both memorial and retreat. The local caretakers maintained the property beautifully, but she insisted on performing certain tasks herself, tending the herb garden he had planted, dusting the books in his library, ensuring that the rooms he had restored with such care remained exactly as he had left them. Now, kneeling beside the irregularity in the bedroom floor, She remembered something from his final journal entry, words she had read so many times they were burned into her memory. P.S. Check the bedroom closet. Third floorboard from the left wall. I hid something there during our week together. Something I was too afraid to give you while I was still alive to see your reaction. If you find it, know that I meant every word. Her heart hammering, Selene pried up the loose board with her fingernails. Underneath, wrapped in soft velvet that had protected it from moisture and time, was a ring. Not the massive diamond she might have expected from a billionaire's proposal, but something simple and perfect, a sapphire, the exact color of the dress she had worn to the Met Gala. Surrounded by small diamonds that caught the afternoon light streaming through the bedroom windows. The stone was flawless, deep blue with flecks of silver that reminded her of moonlight on water. Beside the ring was a folded paper, written in Alaric's precise handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. My dearest Selene, I bought this ring the day after our first merger meeting, when I realized that I was going to lose you to someone who deserved you. I told myself it was foolish, impossible, the fantasy of a dying man who had destroyed any chance of happiness with his own hands. But I kept it anyway, just in case. Just in case you might someday say yes to the question I was too much of a coward to ask while I still had the chance. Will you marry me, Selene? Will you take my name and my love and my promise that in some other timeline, some better world where I made different choices, I would have spent 50 years learning how to make you smile every morning? I know I'm dead as you read this. I know it's too late for yes or no, too late for wedding dresses and ceremonies and all the normal expressions of love that we were denied. But I needed you to know that somewhere in my diseased heart, in the part of me that you taught to feel human again, this question lived every day from the moment I met you. Keep the ring if it makes you happy. Throw it in the ocean if it makes you sad. Sell it and give the money to charity if it feels too complicated to own. But know that it was chosen with more love than I knew I was capable of feeling, by a man who finally learned the difference between wanting something and deserving it. You deserved everything beautiful the world had to offer. I just wish I could have been part of that beauty instead of something you had to overcome. Forever yours, even in death, Alaric. Selene sat on the bed, where they had made love for the first and last time, holding the ring up to the light and watching it throw fragments of blue fire across the white walls. The sapphire was perfect, clearly chosen by someone who had paid attention to every detail of her preferences, who had remembered the exact shade of a dress she had worn to prove she was more than just appropriate. Outside, the eternal rhythm of waves against the cliffs marked the passage of time in a world that had moved on without Alaric Duvall. Portuguese fishermen called to each other from their boats, their voices carried on the wind that had once brought him comfort during his years of self-imposed exile. But here, in this room where love had bloomed too late between two people who had spent years as enemies, time felt suspended. Here, she could almost believe he was still alive, still looking at her with those pale eyes that had learned to see beauty instead of just opportunity. She slipped the ring onto her right hand, not her left. Not yet, maybe never, but her ring finger nonetheless, where she could see it and remember that even monsters could learn to love if they lived long enough to try. The sapphire caught the late afternoon light, throwing sparkles across the room like captured starlight. The ring fit perfectly, of course. Alaric had always paid attention to details. As evening approached, Selene walked through the house one more time, performing the ritual that had become sacred to her over the past year. She checked that the windows were properly sealed against the coming winter storms. She ensured that the books in his library were arranged exactly as he had left them, spines aligned with obsessive precision. She wound the antique clock in the living room that would keep Portuguese time until her next visit. In the kitchen, she prepared a simple dinner from ingredients purchased in the village: tomatoes and fish and bread, the same meal they had shared on their last night together. She ate alone on the terrace, watching the sun sink toward the horizon in a blaze of gold and crimson that would have taken his breath away. The loneliness was different now than it had been in those first months after his death. Then, it had been sharp, raw, the kind of grief that cut through everything else in her life. Now it was gentler, more like missing a song you couldn't quite remember but knew had once made you happy. After dinner, she opened the original journal, not the copy she had found in his office safe, but the leather-bound book that had lived in this house, that contained his most private thoughts about love and redemption and the possibility of becoming someone better than he had been. The final entry, written during their week together, never failed to bring tears to her eyes. She's sleeping in the bed where I've dreamed of her for 12 years, and I can't quite believe she's real. Tomorrow I'll have to take her back to the world where I'm the Ice King and she's the Phoenix, where our love is complicated by everything I've done and everything I can never undo. But tonight, in this house I built with my hands and filled with dreams of her, we're just Alaric and Selene, just two people who found each other at the end of the world and discovered that love doesn't have to be earned or deserved to be real. If there's a God, if there's some cosmic justice I've never believed in, maybe this is it, not punishment for my crimes, but grace I never expected. 7 days of being loved by someone who sees past the monster to whatever small piece of humanity I managed to preserve. I'm going to die soon. The cancer is winning, and there's nothing medicine can do to stop it. But I'm not afraid anymore. How can I be afraid when I've been given this gift? How can I fear death when I've finally learned what it means to be alive? If I could live, I would ask her to marry me. Not because I deserve her, but because she's taught me that love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to see someone's light, even when they've surrounded themselves with darkness. She chose to see mine. For that alone, whatever time I have left has been worthwhile. Selene closed the journal and walked to the stone railing, looking out over the Atlantic where moonlight created a silver path on the dark water. The night was clear, stars visible in patterns that Alaric had learned during his years of solitude, constellations he had studied while thinking about the girl who had grown into a woman strong enough to face him as an equal. "I found the ring," she said to the night sky, her voice carrying over the sound of waves far below. "I found your proposal. And if you had asked me, if you had lived long enough to get down on one knee in this room, I would have said yes." The words hung in the Portuguese air like a prayer, like an answer to a question that would never be asked, like a promise made to someone who would never hear it, but whose love had transformed everything about the woman who spoke it. "I forgive you, Alaric," she whispered to the stars that seemed close enough to touch. "I forgive you for destroying my father. I forgive you for the 12 years of hatred. I forgive you for leaving me before I could save you the way you saved me." A shooting star crossed the sky, brief and brilliant, gone before she could make a wish. But Selene didn't need to wish for anything. She had everything she needed: the memory of 7 days when love had been more real than revenge, the responsibility of using his legacy to heal some small part of the world, and the knowledge that even the most damaged hearts could learn to beat in rhythm with someone else's if they were brave enough to try. Tomorrow, she would return to New York, to the clean energy empire she had built from the ashes of his crimes, to the foundation that bore her father's name and funded dreams that might otherwise be crushed by men like the one Alaric had once been. She would continue the work of transformation, turning profit into purpose, using power to protect instead of destroy. But every year, on the anniversary of their impossible week together, she would come back to this house overlooking the sea. She would wear his shirts and tend his gardens and read his journal by lamplight. She would remember that love could bloom even in the ruins of hatred, that redemption was possible even for those who seemed beyond saving, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories were the ones that ended too soon, but left the world a little bit better for having been lived. The sapphire ring caught the starlight as she raised her hand to touch the pendant at her throat, a small silver moon that had been her father's last gift to her, worn every day for 12 years as a reminder of love that death couldn't diminish. Now she had 2 reminders, one for the father who had raised her to believe in goodness, and one for the enemy who had taught her that goodness could be found even in the darkest places if you were willing to look for it. "Thank you," she said to both of them, "to the memory of Henri Moreau's gentle wisdom and Alaric Duvall's desperate love. Thank you for teaching me that the heart's greatest victory isn't in conquering your enemies, but in learning to grieve for them when they're gone." The wind carried her words out over the Atlantic, toward horizons where other stories were being written. Other hearts were learning the difference between justice and vengeance. Other souls were discovering that love in all its complicated, imperfect forms was always worth the risk of being broken. In the distance, the lighthouse at Cabo de Roca swept its beam across the water, guiding ships safely through the darkness toward whatever dawn was waiting for them. And on the terrace of a house built by love and loss, a woman who had learned that some battles were won, not through destruction, but through the courage to forgive, stood watch over the legacy of two men who had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be human. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, marking time in a universe vast enough to hold both justice and mercy, revenge and redemption, the end of one story and the beginning of whatever came next. My family, Selene and Alaric's story reminds us that the human heart is capable of extraordinary transformation, that sometimes our greatest enemies become our deepest loves, that sometimes the person who hurts us most is the one who understands us best. In the end, Alaric's legacy wasn't his corporate empire or his ruthless reputation. His legacy was the woman he loved enough to set free, the foundation built in her father's name, and the love story that proved even ice can melt when touched by the right kind of fire. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear that broken things can be made whole again, that love can be complicated and still be beautiful, and that sometimes the most powerful act is choosing to create rather than destroy. Subscribe for more stories of hope, and comment below with your own second chance story. You are loved, you are worthy, and your story matters too.